It is really an honor and a privilege to welcome our speaker and introduce him today, Stewart D. McLaurin, President of the White House Historical Association. Stewart has served as president of the association since 2014 and has expanded the association's preservation mission in terms of reach, impact, funding, and education. And one of the association's significant efforts under Stewart's leadership has been to highlight the role of Black people, both enslaved and free, in the construction of the White House. And he's going to talk to us about that today, as well as about the association's broader role in historic preservation of the White House. And we started this conversation during President Nancy Riker's year, when we really were focusing on that event. So I'm glad we can continue to focus on the role of Black people and in our society and community, and to look back at the contributions that they have made. So Stewart has held leadership roles with national nonprofit and higher education organizations for over 35 years, including the American Red Cross, Georgetown University, and the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation. Among his many roles, he currently serves on the board of the Elizabeth Dole Foundation. And I think of special interest to our Twin Club members from Edinburgh, I don't know if any of them is with us today, the National Trust of Scotland, USA Foundation. Some of you might have read the Washington Post article last week, in which Stewart talked about how he would spend his dream day in Washington, DC. This is a man who knows and loves DC, even if he's from elsewhere originally, as most of us are. And I was really challenged, Stewart, by your effort to get to one of our great landmarks each week, because that's definitely something we should all aspire to do. I think, like you, most of us wait until guests come into town. So we need to do better. But with that, I will turn over the mic to you, and thank you so much for joining us. And we look forward to hearing from you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Steve, very much, and to Will as well, and all the members of the DC Rotary Club. It's my privilege to be with you, and I'm speaking to you today from historic Decatur House on the northwest corner of Lafayette Park. You've probably been here or been by it many times, and we're really privileged to co-steward this space with the National Trust for Historic Preservation and operate this as our base of operations and headquarters. I want to give you a bit of history about who we are and what we do and how we came into being. A general survey of the White House and its history, and then delve into the story that Steve alluded to that is so compelling and important about our work today. Well, it was Mrs. Kennedy, Jackie Kennedy, who was First Lady, became First Lady in January of 1961 when her husband became president. And she founded our organization at that time. So this is our 60th anniversary. It's always remarkable to me to think that she was 31 years of age when she became, and she was First Lady for less than 3 years. But what she put in place in terms of process and procedures with historic preservation at the White House, that is still what governs that process today. And it's really remarkable. She realized coming in that the White House needed a private partner to acquire and maintain the museum standard, to acquire elements and maintain the museum standard that she envisioned for the White House. And so we became, in essence, a perfect public-private partnership that we've had for the 12 presidencies now, including the Kennedys. And we are a nonprofit organization. We have no federal funding to support our work at the White House. It's all privately funded. And we're there on behalf of the American people to maintain that museum standard, as I said. Well, before the Kennedys came into the White House, a new president could enter and they would get rid of anything they wanted to that was furnishings or art or decorative arts or rugs. And they often wanted new things rather than old things that we would appreciate today as antiques or Americana. So they used the proceeds from selling off or auctioning off items in the White House to buy these new things. Chester Arthur auctioned off wagon loads of things. James Buchanan auctioned off 52 of 53 pieces of an extraordinary French suite of furniture that James Monroe had brought into the house in 1817. And all of these things, some of which we have recovered, but many of these things are lost to history and can never be recovered. We just do not know where they are, even if they survive. But she put in place the White House Historical Association to be the private partner. She created another group called the Committee for the Preservation of the White House, which is strictly a volunteer advisory board that a president and first lady will go to seek advice on if they want to make changes to a certain room in the White House. And then she also hired the very first curator, the person that would take care of the art and objects of the White House. That had never been done before. But and that's primary to our mission. That's really the core of our work and our mission. But secondary to that, but I also think very important, is she had a heart for education and to teach and tell the stories of the White House and its history, going back to 1792 when George Washington selected that plot of land across the street and the executive mansion began to be built. And the first order of business for us was to publish a guidebook. There was not one that existed about the White House. So we are now in our 25th edition of that book. Here's a copy of it here. The original one looked very similar to this, actually. And this is really the Bible, if you will, of White House history and the interiors and what you experience when you go through the White House. Still our best-selling book of all time. We have now expanded our publications since I've been here in 2014. We've published over 50 titles. All of them are available on our website. One of my favorite things we do is our White House Quiz History Quarterly. This is a very special commemorative issue on the 20th anniversary of 9/11. In black is the chronology of that day. And in red at 9:45 is when the White House was actually evacuated. And this chronicles those stories from the White House staff and others on that day. To tell the story of the White House, you really go back to the story of a man in Ireland, and his name was James Hoban. And he was Roman Catholic, had grown up in County Kilkenny. He had been trained by some of the best architects in Ireland at the time, Thomas Ivory and others. He had been involved in great works in Dublin, such as Leinster House, where the Irish Parliament meets. But because he was Roman Catholic, the penal laws at the time prevented his elevation to the very highest levels of his profession. So I think he was one of the earliest pursuers of the American dream. He left Ireland, he came to America, ended up in Charleston, South Carolina. There he connected with what we believe was a cousin of his, Pierce Purcell, and they built several buildings in Charleston. And it was there in 1791, when George Washington was making his southern tour of the United States, that he met young James Hoban. A year later, Washington was contemplating how he was going to build this federal city. Congress had given him 10 years with the Residence Act from 1790 to 1800 to build a new federal city with a capital for the Congress and a for the president. Washington remembers meeting this Irishman in Charleston and invites him to Philadelphia, and they create a bond, and Washington selects him among many other applicants to be the architect of the White House. Another one of those applicants was actually Thomas Jefferson. But a group of commissioners was created here in the federal city, and Hoban began work with those commissioners to set about building the White House as we now call it today. While he was building this house, we had a community of workers that were around Lafayette Park. And I think Mitch can put up a slide now that will show you just sort of a symbol of Peter Waddell, a great Washington artist, which shows the White House under construction as it would have been from 1792 to 1800. What the story that Steve had mentioned that I really want to delve into here and then also later, and would be happy to take questions and talk about it in more depth. But it was in the spring of 2016 at a commencement address in New York, and then later that summer at the Democratic Convention, that Mrs. Obama said she wakes up every morning in a house that was built by slaves. We were inundated with people wanting to know more information about that, what she had said, what's the story behind the story. And in fact, we did know that us enslaved people were involved with building the White House, but no extensive research had ever been done as to who they were, what their stories were, what we could find out about them, what their roles had been. And so we've undertaken what is now 7 year, going into 6-7 years of research or actually 5 to 6 years of research into who were these people, from whom were they hired, what were their roles, and the next step of this will be, what can we find out about those descended from them? I would love to find a young woman in St. Louis who had no idea that her great-great-great-grandfather had helped build the White House. And if you go to our website today, whitehousehistory.org, you'll see the hundreds of enslaved people that we have identified as best we can, who were enslaved to work on this project, who were enslaved in the president's neighborhood. Actually, here at Decatur House, we have the last remaining example of how enslaved people lived in the president's neighborhood, and we do offer tours of that. But one of the staggering things that we realized, and we've really shown a light on, is that 9 of our earliest American presidents either owned slaves and had those slaves with them in the White House, or they hired slaves. They may not have been slave owners themselves, but they hired slaves to work for them in the White House. We think about presidents and slaves at Mount Vernon, at Monticello, and other plantation type presidential homes. But to think about enslaved people living in the White House and working in the White House is a whole different matter. So that project is ongoing, and I'd really encourage you to learn more about it on our website. But those workers, specifically the enslaved workers, were working in community around what is now Lafayette Park with free workers, stone carvers from Scotland that had come over to carve those very soft sandstone. Had it been a marble stone, it would have been Italians likely that would have been brought in, but the Scots were the best in the world at the softer stone. A quarry was identified 30 miles or so south of Washington in Aquia, Virginia. You can still go there today. It's a county park, and it's a wonderful Saturday or Sunday excursion to walk back and see these actual outcroppings of rock and how they've been carved, and the stone carvers' marks are still there. It's really a step back in time. And they would drag those down to the Potomac shore and raft them upstream close to the banks of the river all the way to the federal city, offload them here on the riverbank, and then drag them over to Lafayette Square. And that's where they would be carved and placed on the building. So it was quite an extraordinary work effort. So there were enslaved workers down in Aquia that did that work, and enslaved workers that were involved in bringing them up the river, and then also in the park once they were done. The stonemasons, I think Mitch has another slide if it's not up already. It's really an extraordinary image of some of their work. This is over the north door of the White House, and this is actually a 14-foot span, and 2 solid blocks were put up above the north door, and out of those blocks, this carving was rendered. At the bottom of the 2 upper garlands, you'll see 1 large cabbage-looking rose on each side. One of our great historians, the late William Seal, discovered that was indeed what the Scots called the double Scottish rose at the time. And it was a sign of Scots immigration out of Scotland. And I like to think of it now as a Scots wink that they put on that carving. And it is now, you'll see it on all the pilasters all around the White House, the columns and the pilasters that are built into the facade of the White House. And it's one of those things that once you know that story and that they put it there as a messaging device, you can't unsee it, at least in my mind's eye, as I look at it to this day. But these are extraordinary, exquisite carvings that were done by the Scottish stonemasons. An interesting thing to me is that in addition, we'll go back to the stonemasons. I recently had the opportunity to bring over a current day stonemason, and we got a block of stone from down here in Aquia, brought it out here to our courtyard, and he carved one of those double Scottish roses using modern tools, not the hand chisels that would have been used at that time. And it was really wonderful to be able to see how that work is done. We also went over to Scotland and put a plaque on Queen Street in Edinburgh, where some of the stonemasons went back after they built the White House, and the plaque is on those homes that they built. And it's wonderful to see the White House image there and telling the story of what they did. Well, obviously, when you're living and working in community, the normal life goes on as well. And one of the dimensions there that also impacts the greater DC area now is worship that took place on Lafayette Park. Hoban was a Roman Catholic, and he started a Catholic worship service in the carpenter's shed. He later built St. Patrick's Church, which is just a stone's throw from where I'm sitting today. And the very first church, of course, that building no longer exists, but that was the first Roman Catholic church. It was, in fact, the first church of any kind that was constructed in the federal city. There was Holy Trinity in Georgetown, but that was thought of as a distance away at that time. And so St. Patrick's was built. The Scots, of course, were Presbyterian, so they also worshiped in that carpenter shed. And now the National Presbyterian Church, as well as New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, trace their roots back to the Scottish stonemasons, and they're worshiping there in the park in that carpenter shed. The Freemason connection is very strong with Hoban, and Hoban was a Freemason in Charleston, and George Washington was a Freemason as well. And so there was strong Masonic activity that took place there, and Hoban was instrumental in beginning the lodge work in, and I see somebody put up a message that said in Georgetown Presbyterian. I also, amen to that. So cannot leave out our friends there. So the Masons were also important. Well, the object of this in Washington's mind and how he had these workers all working together was to create a stone house. These were not common in our country at the time, but they were very common in the great European capitals. Washington believed that a president's home made out of stone would be respected by leaders in Europe, but also admired by those here in this country as well. And he knew that Hoban would have been familiar with that type of building in Edinburgh, I keep saying Edinburgh, in Dublin. In fact, if you go to Dublin today, which I have done, and you see Leinster House, which I mentioned, which is the home to Parliament, you see that great facade and you think that's the White House. That looks like the White House. And you go over to what was then the old Newcomen Bank, which is now government office buildings in Dublin today. And you go inside and you see these oval rooms, which are perfectly reminiscent of the oval rooms in the main house today, the diplomatic reception room, the blue room, the yellow oval room up on the residence floor. And so you see how these spaces that he would have experienced in Dublin would have inspired him and his plan that Washington agreed to here. Well, the first residents of the White House move in 1800, and that's John and Abigail Adams. And if you've seen the David McCullough miniseries, the Adams come up to the front door and they're moving through the mud and the upper gangplank up into the north door, and they notice the slaves that are working, and that's a bit startling to them that they realize the labor of the slaves that have been part of creating this great home. And they walk in and they see the Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington, which is already there. In fact, to this day, or as of today, that Gilbert Stuart portrait was the only item, or remains the only item in the entire White House that was there in November of 1800 when the Adams moved in, and is still in the White House today, only that one item. Well, things go along pretty well until the British invade in 1814 as part of the War of 1812. The White House is burned. Of course, you know that story well. There was a push to move the White House up onto Meridian Hill, or perhaps into Rock Creek Park, where it would be better protected. There was another push to move it as far west in the country as you could go, and that was to Cincinnati. So it would be farther inland and not as much of a threat to invading forces. James Madison said, no, we will rebuild the White House as it was, and we will do it right here. And that took 3 years until James Monroe moved in, and it was under Monroe that the famous rounded south portico was added. Then the next presidency with Andrew Jackson, the north portico was added, and that completed the look of the White House that we know it today. We move forward into the next big moment in White House construction history was the Teddy Roosevelt restoration around the turn of the century into 1900, 1901, 1902. And this is when, at that point, the president still had his office up on the residence floor where the president's family lived. And the Roosevelts were a rambunctious bunch. And so Mrs. Roosevelt and the president thought it best that the family have their quarters. the president had built what we now refer to as the West Wing. And the president's offices were moved off of the residence floor over into the West Wing, where they remain today. Coolidge later added heavy rooftop because he wanted to add floors on. So layering was gone, and weight was added onto the top of the White House. And this will prove perilous when it comes to the presidencies of Franklin Roosevelt. And the White House is really starting to show its wear. And there's really a significant need for maintenance of the White House, but because there's the Depression, because there's a Great World War, that was all deferred. Truman then realizes during his presidency that this cannot be put off. We would walk on the residence floor, the great Bohemian chandeliers in the East Room would sway. The Margaret Truman was playing the piano one night, and the piano leg went through the floor into the ceiling below. And so Truman and his family moved out for almost 4 years. And you can see from these very compelling pictures here that the interior of the White House was completely gutted down to the dirt sub-basement, and steel beams replaced the wooden structure that had been in existence from the rebuild after the 1814 fire. And it was due to his sacrifice and patience, President Truman, that the entire White House was built back with very slight interior modification to what it had been. And that brings us to the modern day construct of the White House. And then it was Mrs. Kennedy who came along in 1961 and completed the story of maintaining this beautiful home of our presidents and their families on behalf of the American people. And so we're greatly indebted to Mrs. Kennedy and to all the first ladies and presidents who have followed her. And all of them have adhered to this great custom and tradition of taking on projects during their presidency, working with us, having those funded by us, and leaving the House better than they had found it. I think that I would have to point out a couple of things about our work. We've been funded. Many of you know the annual White House Christmas ornament that's been in existence since 1981. I often joke that if I'd been in the room with Mrs. Reagan when somebody came in with that idea, I probably would have thought, fine, go ahead and make the ornament. But thank goodness they did, because I don't know that we would, I know we wouldn't have been able to do the work we've done without that. And I don't even know that we would be in existence today without that. So 41 years of this ornament, it's a teaching tool, it's a wonderful gift, and it does go to help maintain the White House, but also our education programs. And in addition to our books, we have teacher institutes, we have online programming, we have a robust digital library of resources that are available to scholars and students and others. And it's really an amazing resource that we've been able to do in addition to as a result of those ornaments, but also our traditional fundraising, which actually didn't really start until 2015. So we are really humbled and honored to meet Mrs. Kennedy's ongoing legacy with historic preservation, and we take on new opportunities to tell the stories of that work. I'll tell you one thing that has been our most recent project, and it relates to the enslaved workers in the president's neighborhood, is just in August, we unveiled 3 wayside markers at the north end of Lafayette Park, where 8th Street meets Black Lives Matter Plaza. And each of those markers tells one of the compelling stories of the history of that space. Thousands of people traverse that park every day without having any idea of the history of that land beneath their feet. One of these boards tells about the work of those enslaved workers, along with the free workers, that on that land that you see in front of you built that house that is the greatest symbol of American freedom and democracy in the world today. The center, another board tells the story of protests in the park that began in 1917 with the suffragist movement, and that have escalated today and continue today to include the dynamic and extraordinary expression of a feeling and passion and thoughts after the murder of George Floyd. And that was right outside our front door here at Decatur House. And then the third one talks about Mrs. Kennedy and her work to save the park. When the Kennedys came into office, Eisenhower had already adopted a plan to tear down all the historic buildings on either side of the park. And those big, tall, red brick buildings that are on either side now set back were supposed to be flush up against the park. Thanks to the Kennedys, those were moved back. So the new executive office building and the courts building on the east were set back, and the historic buildings were retained, and the historic feeling of the park was saved. So in a very short period of time, I've taken you through a whole long period of White House history, some really key and important players, the unheard voices whose voice we're trying to make bold now, and the enslaved workers who helped build the house, and someone like a young James Hoban, whose name is largely not known, but whose life's work, that White House, is known the world over. So it's our privilege to really tell those stories on behalf of the American people, and would love for you to follow us on social media. We have great, robust social media every day that breaks off pieces of this history and tells that. And then we also have our public programming. So you're welcome to follow us on social, or follow us on our website, and you'll learn about that programming as well. So it's really been a privilege to speak with you. I'd love to answer any questions if that's fitting and appropriate, and really thank you for your interest in our work.
Wow, thank you so much for that. I'm hoping Mitch can put the social media, some of the links in there, so everybody can see what they are in our chat function, or one of your team members can do that. That would be great. I just want a little tip. My family gives Christmas ornaments to all the cousins because we got tired of giving people toys that break after a day. And one of the great ornaments to give is the birth year of the kid, the ornament. Right. Now every kid has been born, they've got one from their birth year. So I recommend that to anybody if you're looking for a really cool gift, Christmas ornament that comes from their birth year and celebrates some aspect of the White House. So thank you.
Well, Steve, I will mention that's a great point. We continue to make them going back to that first year. So you can buy all 41 of them, or go back and pick up a year that you'd like to. That's a great idea about birthdays. But it's important to know also that these are made all in America, have been for the past 41 years, by a veteran-founded small business in Rhode Island. None of them are made offshore. These are American-made items every year.
They're fabulous. I got about 10 of them. They're all great. So I recommend them highly. So we have about 5 minutes, a little more, and we've got some questions. So the first one goes to Dr. Sam. So if you'd unmute yourself and ask your question, and then after that, David Krukoff.
Stuart, thank you very much for making this presentation, and you made it so like we were just chatting with you, and was very interactive, and thank you for doing it. But my question is how can our club collaborate with you as far as maybe having both public and private school students come in and take tours at the White House? I know that or some aspect of that maybe in your museum that could add to their curricula, the standards of quality. But I think there's all this outreach you're doing through the media, nothing like showing up and seeing it and physically being in your space.
You are exactly right. In fact, I'm in our conference room now, but adjacent to this is my office. And on my office wall, I have a picture of my 5th grade class trip to Washington, D.C., and it's taken on the Capitol lawn. And I have very vivid memories of that trip and the impact that the Capitol, the White House, Mount Vernon, had on me. Now, did I end up doing what I did as a career because of that? I don't know, but I do know that it had some impact on me, and to see these places and have it brought to life is so important. And I would love to have our education team work with the club, and I'll follow up on that, to think of ways that we could do that. Right now, the White House remains closed to tours, and I suspect that will probably continue until the first of the year. I don't know what they're going to do yet about the holidays. We have a White House Visitor Center, which we operate in conjunction with the National Park Service. It's on the ground floor of the Commerce Building at 1450 Pennsylvania Avenue. The next best thing to going to the White House. It's interactive exhibits. It's very Smithsonian caliber of looking at the White House as home to the president and his family, office to the president and his staff, ceremonial stage upon which we receive our most important visitors to our country, but also a museum. So that's a great experience. But at your suggestion, which is a terrific one, I'll have our education team follow up and think about how we can collaborate on such a project.
Stuart, thank you very much. And we look forward to working with you.
Thank you.
David, over to you.
Stewart, thank you so much for speaking with our Rotary today. It's been great to listen to you and to learn about the White House from you. I am involved in DC enfranchisement. I'm actually the leader of the retrocessionists. During the hearing in the last summer in June on the Senate side, one of the retorts to either 51st statehood or to a second retrocession was that the people that lived in the federal enclave would potentially gain 3 electoral votes through the 23rd Amendment. And one of the testifiers stated that there was about 60 people within the census tract that was the federal enclave that lived within the White House, maybe potentially Lafayette Park where you work, and potentially on the mall. To your knowledge, how many people on average live in this area? And could you expound upon who those people are?
That's really fascinating to think about. To my knowledge, the only people that would live in any of this property, there's no one who currently lives on any of the properties around Lafayette Park on the east and the west side. On the south side, the president and his family lives in the White House, but they would be the only ones that are there as permanent or temporary, but permanent residents in that building.
All of whom vote out of state, but anybody else within
I'm not aware, David. I cannot have, the mall is lined by the Smithsonian buildings and the memorials, the monuments. I just can't imagine any beyond President and Dr. Biden that would have that status. That's a mystery to me. I do not know. I can tell you, even Blair House, which is at the end of this block, no one lives there. Decatur House, no one lives here. The Dolly Madison House across the way, no one lives there. And then in the rest of the buildings, these are office and courts buildings. There's no residential space whatsoever.
Okay, well, that reinforces what I had suspected, and I really appreciate your answer.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bill, I think you're going to wind up our Q&A with Bill Busker, wind it up with the last question.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really terrific.
Thank you.
I happen to be in front of the Decatur House in Lafayette Square yesterday, having worked at the U.S. Chamber for many years, and I was kind of shocked by what seemed like a declining situation of the neighborhood around there, with restaurants closed and homeless people on park benches and so forth. And so my question is, as someone who works there on a daily basis, is there any effort going on to try to renew the area?
From your mouth to God's ears, I would love that to happen. We, after the George Floyd protests and after the political disruption of the past year, we realized that so many of us around the park and in the president's neighborhood, we knew of each other, but we really didn't have a relationship with each other. So we've created a neighborhood group that involves everybody from the chamber to the AFL-CIO, to the Hay Adams, us, the new Milken Museum that's across the way, Blair House. And we get together regularly, we share information. The Park Service is also a part of that. And they are really the driver and the player because they own that real estate that is Lafayette Park. And when we put up those waysides the other day with their cooperation, just getting them to cut the grass was a Herculean effort. So it's really tough. We're thankful that the fencing has come down that was up around us for so long. That finally came down in July. And I can tell you that several of the neighbors want to improve the look and feel of the park itself. The fountains aren't working. The grass isn't cut regularly. It just looks run down. And certainly this is a place where people gather. The protests are absolutely critical, vital First Amendment right. And things will get trampled on a little bit from time to time, but they need to be maintained. And between those episodes, things need to look as they should look. I would love to. We're doing one beautification part on our own in front of Decatur House and our two townhouses. In fact, we had a It's been blessed by the Commission on Fine Arts. We had another meeting on it this morning. We're doing a garden, a 3-townhouse garden there to honor the legacy of Mrs. Kennedy and what she did to save the park and her work in the White House. So that's going to be major beautification in front of our 3 townhouses of real estate right here. And I know the chamber has just undergone a nice renovation of their building as well. And that's really looks beautiful over there. But it's going to take a little bit of all of us, especially our friends from the Park Service, to roll up their sleeves and do this together. But this is America's public square right here. And it really needs to carry that look and that image and that feel.
We have a natural segue. It turns out that we have a partnership with the National Park Service.
Oh, great.
For a program called Trees for the Capital. We've been doing it for 30 years. And initially, we were involved with planting replacement cherry blossom trees down around the tidal basin on the Washington Monument grounds. More recently, in your neighborhood at Farragut Square, we started planting native trees. We now plant 45 trees a year. And guess what?
Oh.
One of the next trees will be in your honor. We
thank
plant
you.
a tree along with our partners, the National Park Service, in honor of each of our speakers. And if we were meeting in person, which I wish we were, I would be handing you a tree certificate symbolizing our commitment.
Well, that is incredible. I love that. I love that. That's really wonderful. And once it's planted, if you have any idea where it is, I'd love to know.
And guess what? We have worked out the coordinates of each tree. So we will be able to tell you which is your tree.
That's wonderful. That's one of the nicest things I've ever received. Thank you very much.